All right, students, welcome to Unit 13, where we'll be discussing ethics and ethics in psychology. This is a really important topic, one that every research method should not go without. Our objectives today is we're going to review when ethics have been violated in the past. Next, we're going to learn core ethical principles in psychological research. Lastly, we'll review APA ethical standards that relate to psychological research. I want to start off this lecture by talking about how complicated of a subject ethics actually is. It's really never just a case of what's right or what's wrong. There's a lot of gray area associated with ethics. It's a very complex topic, and you'll see, as we'll discuss through our examples of how ethics has changed over the past, that has changed a lot through the decades. Our understanding of ethics has changed dramatically from when we first started discussing it, and at some point we weren't even discussing ethics. And psychological research in particular has been has had a lot of progressing change in the way that we deal with ethics overall. For this lecture, we're going to start off with two examples of unethical studies that have happened, two very famous studies that happened in medical and psychological research. Then we'll be discussing kind of some of the things that come out to discuss these core ethical principles on ethics so that we can further later deal with them and have a better understanding of what ethics are. To start, we're going to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study. This was a study that started in 1932. It was a longitudinal study that utilized 600 black men, and keep in mind, it was black men in particular, so that they can conduct experimental research on them. The goal of this study was to study untreated syphilis. So, throughout this study, what they were doing is lying to participants and not telling them what the true ethical portion of the study was. So many questionable ethical decisions were made throughout this study. First of all, they lied to the participants. They didn't tell them that this was actually a study for syphilis. They told participants that they had bad blood rather than telling them that they actually had syphilis. Next, there was a point in this experimental study in which participants were given a spinal tap. However, the experimenters ended up lying to the participants, saying that this was a spinal tap, but it was, of course, saying this was a special free treatment. And if you don't know what a spinal tap is, it's a very painful procedure in which they're essentially extracting spinal fluid. This was not a special free treatment for the individuals that were part of them. For the 600 black men that were part of this study, this was simply an experimental study. So they were just getting information, and they lied to them and did not give them all the information they can to leave the study if they wanted to. Additionally, at one point throughout the study, an actual treatment for syphilis had been devised throughout the course of the study. However, these participants weren't even told that they had syphilis. They were only told that they had bad blood so that they could continue to have these quote-unquote special free treatments, which were spinal taps and other things, and they didn't even know about what it was that they were receiving treatment for, whatever the treatment was. And additionally, even though treatments were out for syphilis at this time, they didn't even tell the participants that they could get this treatment, nor did the participants even know they could get this treatment that was available for them. So, throughout this extremely unethical study, there were three unethical choices that this fell into. First of all, participants were not treated respectfully. They were lied to. They were told a lot of different things starting off in 1932. You have to keep in mind, 1932 was a very different time. Additionally, participants were harmed. Think about the consequences of not telling someone what the disease they actually had was, and additionally having to do this painful spinal tap throughout the study. Lastly, researchers targeted a disadvantaged social group. And notice how I emphasize that this was 600 black men in general, and these were black men from poorer communities as well. They're honestly looked at and upon as lower than human beings throughout this study. So for this medical study, it's just one time of many other research studies that were happening during this time. This one's probably just the most famous of them all, in which researchers did not treat humans with respect. Next is the Milgram obedience study. Before you actually before we actually talk about this slide, I would love for you to go to the actual PDF and click on this YouTube link and watch the Milgram obedience study if you don't know about it, so that I don't have to explain it. But I'll explain it in a little bit of detail here, but please be sure and watch the video beforehand. Overall, the Milgram obedience study was a study in which they had participants come in and give electrical shocks to Confederate strangers, Confederates, which are just participants that were acting like participants. And there's a lot of stressful indications that this had to give on the true participants that were administering the shocks. So, throughout this Milgram obedience study, there was a lot of questionable research ethics associated with this. One of them was questionable debriefing. Debriefing is essentially when you, after a study, you tell the participant everything that happened in the study, why it happened, and where they can go to reach help if they need it. So although participants were debriefed, they were not told that the Confederate in this study was actually not harmed in the study at all. So really, when we talk about the Milgram obedience study and the Tuskegee syphilis study, we have to ask ourselves, was it worth the risk, and did we gain the knowledge we needed from these studies, despite all the unethical things that happened throughout the studies? Now, the funny thing is, I will say, throughout the syphilis study and the Milgram obedience study, we did learn a lot despite the unethical behaviors that were performed during that. So it's great that we did learn a lot of information from that. From Milgram obedience study, we learned a lot about authority and how people respond to authority. Additionally, in the Tuskegee syphilis study, we learned a lot about syphilis and how it works in people, but that's at the cost of these participants not being treated like human beings. Therefore, it's really a questionable, was it worth the risk? I, of course, say no, but there's a lot of gray area associated with these with ethics. As I stated before, it's not a matter of right or wrong. And additionally, what was viewed as right and what was viewed as wrong before is completely different than what we view as right or wrong now. Before, it would be unheard of to recruit only black men so that you can perform things like spinal taps and not telling them about a disease that they had. That's unheard of. But obviously, in 1932, things were a little different. Since these studies were performed, a lot of core ethical principles have come out about it since then. From the studies that we mentioned before, and many other studies that had many ethical violations, questionable ethics associated with it, ended up coming up to the creation of this called the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was created in 1976. Keep in mind the Tuskegee syphilis study started in 1932, so we're talking about 40 years after the fact. But the Belmont Report was created in 1976 by many scientists. So this is a team that includes ethicists, philosophers, physicians, and so forth, and etc., in which they discussed how to have actual ethics associated with research studies of human subjects. This is our first attempt at making standardized core ethical principles with research involving human subjects. Within the Belmont Report, there's three main principles for guiding ethical decision making. The first is that all studies should have respect for persons, despite race, culture, creed, or anything else beyond that. Next, beneficence. All studies should have some sort of beneficial attribute associated with it that benefits both the participant as well as the greater good community. Lastly, justice. All participants should have justice and should be able to leave the study at any time based on their feelings towards the study. And they should additionally know all aspects of a study before entering. They should know the risks. They should know the risks associated with joining the research study. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into those three ethical principles that were associated with the Belmont Report. The first is the respect for persons. And the respect for persons, there's two provisions. The first being participants should be free to make up their mind about research. In other words, all participants should be given informed consent to participate in research. This means that any research study that is performed with human subjects needs to create some sort of document outlining what is going to be done in the research study, and additionally, the participant should consent to partake in the research study. Additionally, people with less autonomy, this includes children, prisoners, people with intellectual disabilities, are entitled to special protections from informed consent. So these populations must be treated with special considerations. For example, if you're working with children or adolescents like I do in my research, it's not enough to get a signature from the child because it's a child. They don't have the capabilities to understand all aspects of a research study in order to make an informed decision. Therefore, in these special populations that include children, prisoners, and people with intellectual disabilities, there needs to be some other consenting process that is special towards them. For example, with children, we need to have parental consent as well as child ascension as well. When child assent means essentially they informed consent as well as the parents. Prisoner populations are kind of interesting. The reason we include prisoner populations is because oftentimes it's wondered, does a prisoner have the actual right or do they have the right to decline the study because they are in prison? So this is a special population that we may be violating human ethical rights by even doing research on prisoner populations in general. I'm not going to say every research study that has used prisoner populations is unethical, but it is possible that because you're working with a prisoner population, they didn't have the ability to say no to your study like a normal population would. The next aspect of the Belmont Report is an aspect called beneficence. In beneficence, researchers are often taking precautions to protect participants from harm and ensure the most well-being possible. So, in these cases, researchers must assess the risks and the benefits of any study that they plan to conduct. How much will the study benefit the community? And additionally, is that worth the risk that we put on our participants in the study? So, do the pros outweigh the cons? Additionally, this has a lot of implications about control groups. We learned about control groups in pre-test post designs as well as experimental designs. In a control group, if you have an evidence-based treatment that is already available, then you cannot have a true control group. This is especially true with medication research. For example, if there is a medication already on the market that treats pain, in participants, and you have developed a new drug that helps with pain, you cannot truly split your participants into a true control group of one that does not receive treatment and one that does receive treatment. Rather, you need to have a kind of quasi-control group in which one is for the control group. This quasi-control group is given the already designated treatment for pain, and we compare it to the new treatment of pain that we can, because it is unethical to have a true control group in these cases. Additionally, for the beneficence aspect of the Belmont Report, it's additionally beneficial and required that if a treatment is found to work better halfway through a study, then you must offer this treatment to a control group. This is essentially what happened in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Originally, in the Tuskegee syphilis study, when they started the study, there was no treatments available for syphilis. However, halfway through the study, treatments for syphilis came out. However, they were not telling participants that they had syphilis, and they furthermore were not providing them the treatment that they could have had for syphilis that was already out. Therefore, if a treatment is found out halfway through a study or at any point throughout the study, it doesn't have to even be halfway, even if it's at the beginning of the study, you must offer that treatment to the control group. And it's ethical to do so. Lastly, the beneficence aspect also talks about personal information. In a study that uses human subjects in it, it's an essential thing that you either make it an anonymous study or as confidential as possible. It's preferred that the study being anonymous, which means there's absolutely no identifying information being collected on the individual regarding their personal information. However, this isn't always possible. For example, take in the case of a pre-post study, you need to be able to track participants from pre to post. Therefore, you cannot have an anonymous study. In these cases where it's unable to be an anonymous study, we use something called a confidential study. A confidential study is when identifying information is collected but kept separate from the data, and it all means is kept as confidential as possible with the most data, whatever sort of data security techniques you can use. That's either using a password on a computer or even a lock and key to secure data in which identifying information is there. So the Belmont Report really addresses these three aspects in which researchers must first take precautions to protect participants from harm and well-being. Second, that it deals with treatment groups in stating that if there's an evidence-based treatment already available, then you cannot have a true control group. And lastly, for this beneficence aspect, it also identifies the differences in personal information in which all studies using human subjects need to either be an anonymous study or a confidential study. The last aspect associated with the Belmont Report is this idea of justice. In justice, it calls for a fair balance between the kinds of people who participate in research and those who benefit from the research. This again relates back to the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which only Black male individuals were used for the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it benefited mostly white communities. Therefore, the Belmont Report took control and said, that's not fair. That's not how this works anymore. If you're conducting an experimental study with human subjects, it's a requirement that those that are taking part in the study are also the same people that are being benefited from the study. So essentially, this relates to external validity as well, as in saying your population of interest should be the individuals that are taking the risk in the study as well as benefiting from the study as well, and which also makes it a more externally valid study. So really this works on two great levels, on an ethical level as well as an externally valid level. After the Belmont Report was put out, eventually the American Psychological Association created 5 general principles. It's called the APA's 5 general principles. And really what it did is added 2 more aspects to the Belmont Report. So, beneficence and non-maleficence is the first one. That's essentially the same as the Belmont Report, in which in beneficence and non-maleficence, you need to treat people in ways that benefit them, do not cause suffering, and conduct research that will only benefit society. If the research at the end of the day does not benefit society, then there's no point in performing the research at all. Additionally, it associates with fidelity and responsibility. And fidelity and responsibility, we need to establish relationships of trust, accept responsibility for professional behavior in research, teaching, and clinical practices. The next one is integrity. In the APA's 5 general principles for integrity, it is important and essential for a researcher to strive to be as accurate, truthful, and as honest as possible. Next is the idea of justice, which we already talked about in the Belmont Report. The idea of justice has still not changed, in which we need to strive to treat all groups of study of people fairly and sample research participants from the same populations that will benefit from the research, as well as being aware of our biases that are associated with researching these populations. So again, this relates back to the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which only black men were participating in the study and were not told that they had syphilis, even though a treatment was available for syphilis studies. In this day and age, if that happened, that would be completely unethical, and you can actually be fined and put to jail for performing a study of that magnitude. Next is the idea of respect for people's rights and dignity. For respect for people's rights and dignity, it's important that you recognize that people are an autonomous agent. This respect for rights and dignity protects people's rights, including the rights to privacy and the right to give consent for treatment and research. Additionally, it gives the right to have participants treated confidentially. Keep in mind that relates back to our informed consent, as well as the difference between anonymity and confidential research. Additionally, it's important for us to understand that some populations may be less able to give this autonomous consent. For example, children populations and prisoner populations as well. And taking precautions against coercing such people to participate in research studies when they are unable to do so, like that happened in the Milgram study, in which participants of that study were oftentimes coerced to participate in a study that could have maleficence associated with it. The APA ethical standards is a list of many ethical standards. It's a long manual, actually. If you type into Google APA ethical standards, you'll actually find the entire list of ethical standards that the APA follows. A lot of it has to do with therapeutic and client relations and confidentiality. However, for the purposes of this class, we're only going to be focusing on APA ethical standard number 8. Which relates to all of the ethical standards that researchers must follow. I want to go ahead and state that all the other standards are just as important, but beyond the scope of this class to talk about. There's many things that have come out of APA Ethical Standards 8. That's the creation of institutional review boards, informed consent in all psychological research, descriptions on how to handle deception, and additionally, debriefing. So let's go ahead and start off with the institutional review boards. An institutional review board is a committee responsible for upholding all ethical principles on human subjects. Within any government-granted project that you work on, you will be required to go through an institutional review board. Additionally, all public universities have an institutional review board related to them. All the institutional review board does is it requires you to submit a proposal for your study and for you to talk about every single ethical standard that you've taken within your study. Additionally, they look through it and will decide whether or not to approve your study and decide whether or not it complies with ethical standards. It's an extremely, really great way for researchers to think about it. Every time I conduct a research study, I'm required to post my research study through the institutional review board. It's a little bit of a pain to write all the information about my study, but it really gets me thinking about the ethical considerations, especially because I work with adolescent populations. In these adolescent populations, there's a lot of characteristics and ethical standards that you need to comply with, because things like what is considered informed consent for an adolescent. For all adolescents, if they want to participate in my research, it's required that they get parental consent as well. Speaking of informed consent, that's what APA Ethical Standard 8 also talks about, in which participants must be given all of the information of a study and decide if they would like to participate in it or not. And again, we need to think about special populations of adolescents, children, prisoner populations, intellectually disabled populations, and determine whether or not they are able to provide full informed consent to participate in a research study. The next aspect that APA Ethical Standard 8 talks about is the idea of deception. Like that was used in the Milgram obedience study, deception was utilized. APA Ethical Standard 8 states that in all cases, deception should be heavily discouraged as much as possible. Unless it is completely necessary for the case of your study, deception should not be used. We need to treat all participants with a form of respect and not lie to them. Additionally, in the cases where deception cannot be avoided for the case of your study, you need to make a strong argument as to why it benefits the community. Why is deception so essential? Additionally, the deception that you do participate in, it needs to have minimal risk associated with it. And then lastly, one of the greatest things that APA Ethical Standard 8 came up with is the idea of debriefing. All participants must be debriefed about all conditions in a study or if they have been deceived in any way. So even if there is deception associated with your study, you need to, at the end of your study, to debrief them and let them know about every aspect that they were lied to, or if there was any conditions that they were made unaware of at the beginning of the study. So if we would have gone through Milgram's obedience study, it would have been run a lot differently in today's standards because participants were not properly debriefed at the end of the Milgram obedience study. Thus, it would violate a lot of these ethical standards. Additionally, the Milgram obedience study did not go through an institutional review board. Nobody reviewed the ethics of it beforehand. Therefore, any of these risks to the participants could have been avoided if Milgram would have had an IRB on hand to go through. Additionally, there's a lot more to APA Ethical Standard 8. The next part talks about data fabrication and data falsification. So I'd like to first talk about what the difference between data fabrication and data falsification is. Data fabrication is when a researcher invents data to fit their hypothesis, whereas falsification is kind of like the other side. So they're both about the same coin of a different side. And data falsification is when a researcher influences study results in the data set so that it fits their hypothesis. So think about it this way. Data fabrication is when somebody is adding in new cases so that it fits their hypothesis. Additionally, data falsification is when a researcher will delete data so that it fits their hypothesis. And really, even if you don't know the differences between these words, just don't do any of it. It's just completely wrong. It's just completely wrong to manipulate data in any way that does not work. It's completely wrong to add in unreal data sets as well, unreal data points as well. So really just don't participate in data fabrication or data falsification in any way. It's only going to lead to trouble. Many people have been caught. There's a lot of different ways to catch people who falsify and fabricate data. The fortunate thing about data is that data speaks. Data is real, and we are able to have ways of determining whether someone fabricated or falsified data. I have seen this in the literature of people catching individuals with data fabrication and falsification, and it is not a pretty process. You will get in loads of trouble if you are caught fabricating or falsifying data. Next, the APA ethical standards talk about plagiarism. Plagiarism is when you represent some other person's work as your own. This is why in psychology we're oftentimes so obsessed with having you cite your sources. It's okay to talk about other people's works, and in fact it's encouraged to talk about other people's works in your research and your literature reviews. Even if you're doing a meta-analytic review, you need to talk about the past literature. However, when you're doing that, you need to cite who it is that originally said that. You can't take credit for things that people have said in the past. And the last implication that APA Ethical Standard 8 talks about is animal research. And in animal research, it's best to remember the 3 R's that are associated with it. The first R is replacement, in which researchers should find alternative ways to animal research whenever possible. Next is refinement, in which researchers must modify experimental procedures to minimize or eliminate any animal distress. And you got to think, these are very similar to the way that we treat human subjects as well. We need to treat human subjects and animal subjects in the way that we reduce distress as much as possible. And then next is reduction, in which researchers should adopt experimental designs that require the least amount of animals as possible. So it's really great that the APA took the time to consider animals in part of their ethical standards as well, because animals, beyond that of human subjects, should have justice as well. So in summary, what we talked about today is that psychological research has played into a lot of unethical studies in the past. It's an unfortunate thing about the past with the Tuskegee syphilis study as well as the Milgram's obedience studies, in which many people experienced distress from that study afterwards. And if there was an IRB or some sort of ethical form of governments available to Milgram at the time, that could have potentially been avoided. The kind of a caveat to that, though, is that although these unethical studies were performed, some of the studies have provided us with valuable information. The Tuskegee syphilis study did provide us with a lot of information. The Milgram obedience study provided us a lot of information about authoritative roles and how that plays into obedience. But you have to question, at what cost was this done? Once we kind of started realizing that there were a lot of ethical violations being performed in research in general. This is not just psychological research. This is all research in general, especially within the biological sciences. The Belmont Report was created to first give an indication of ethics as being an important part of research, and it had a main focus on medical research, but psychology obviously took note of the Belmont Report. Then later, the APA created several guidelines on how to perform specifically psychological research ethically, and we know that specifically from the APA Research Ethical Standards number 8, in which it talks about all of the guidelines associated with research in general.